Okay, hi and welcome everybody to this installment of Determinate Content. Today we are very pleased to be joined by Michael Devitt, who is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at CUNY, the Graduate Center. And Michael Devitt is the author of Realism and Truth, Designation, Coming to Our Senses, and many other articles and books. And today we're discussing his book, Putting Metaphysics First, Essays on Metaphysics and Epistemology from 2011. So the first question, which I ask to everyone who's on this interview series, is how did you get into philosophy and why do you think it's a worthwhile pursuit?
Yes, it's interesting. Yeah, how did I see? I have a sense that I actually was always interested in philosophy, and sort of scarcely right out of the womb, I was just interested in philosophical questions. And there's a story in my family which sort of captures this. I mean, I was always struggling to get a world view, I think. And the story is that when I was 3 or so, I, like all other children in those days, was told about Santa Claus. As you know, the tradition, which I think is a terrible tradition, is that people are told about Santa Claus, which is a nice story, but they're also told it as if it's true, and they're told as if they have to believe it. Now, I said the 3-year-old child's version is of something like, "You've got to be kidding." And this upset people no end, but I just simply did not accept this because I thought it didn't fit in, I assume, into my worldview. So all through my childhood, I was always skeptical. That's one thing, and always interested in big questions. So that went through. And when I was at my, though Australian, I was, for reasons we won't go into, I was brought up in England from 8 to 19, and I went to an English public school, where I had actually an excellent education. And at that point, it was a free-flowing sort of education, and you could often, I was in a class where you just had to read books and talk about them, and you just could pick any book you liked out of the library, and I picked Russell's Problems of Philosophy, because I'd always had this sort of interest, and that really what got me going, I think. And I was so engaged with this book that I then requested permission to. I'd already been doing physics and mathematics for some time, and I'd already got A-level physics, and I requested permission to no longer do any physics and to replace that with philosophy. And I was tutored by the headmaster, who was actually had studied philosophy. And so I moved on from that to Ayres Language, Truth and Logic. And so I'd done all this when I was in the equivalent of high school. But then for various personal reasons, I didn't go on. I went back to Australia, and I didn't go immediately to university. I had to go and earn a living, or so I thought, and I didn't see any way I could earn a living out of philosophy. So I did something else just because I had to do something, and I did accountancy, actually. But when I'd finished that, which I finished very fast, when I was only 22, I had already noted that Sydney University had classes at night, and so I could combine doing my now quite high-paid and demanding job. I could go to university at night, and I went and I started philosophy in 1962 at Sydney University. I did psychology too at night, so I was a very busy guy, and I was just absolutely bowled over when I had some wonderful teachers, including John Mackey, and I was just bowled over by philosophy. I was bowled over by the whole philosophical community at Sydney University, which was terrific. And I actually was so bowled over within 6 months that I thought I'd made a terrible mistake doing accounting. Mind you, I wasn't unhappy in accounting. I had a very good job, and I was very well treated. and the job was interesting. It just wasn't really my sort of thing. And I simply told them, look, I'm going to try and get myself a scholarship, and then I'm going to give up accounting. They couldn't believe that. It was actually, they felt, I was worried about saying it to them because I felt they would take it as I was saying sort of, oh, well, fuck in your church. But I wasn't. I was really just engaged with philosophy. So that's how it, I'd always been interested. And then suddenly I thought, my God, I could actually, maybe I could make a living out of this. So I did it at Sydney, and I did well. And then I went to America. I was the first person to go, first Australian to go to America to study, to get a PhD in philosophy that I know of. It's now quite common. But in those days, the students who were going on in philosophy to postgraduate work would go to England, always to Oxford. So I was the first one to come to America. Yeah. So that's basically how I got in it. And well, why I think it's worthwhile, I think we're pursuing the frontiers of knowledge, and the virtue of knowing about the world seems to me to be obvious. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So this series is about different conceptions of metaphysics as well. So I was wondering if you'd like to say something about why you think metaphysics in particular might be a worthwhile pursuit.
Right. Well, metaphysics, yes. Metaphysics has got a bit of a bad name, particularly sort of the positivists gave it a bad name because, of course, there was an awful lot of stuff being done in metaphysics, which they, being scientifically minded people, took a rather dim view of. Most obviously, of course, Heidegger and so on. But my view of metaphysics, as you know, is very naturalistic. And so my answer to the question has got to be a bit different from the sort of answer, I suppose, that your traditional philosopher would give to this question. The traditional philosopher thinks that there are these metaphysical questions which are not scientific questions, and they transcend science, and they're to be investigated by a priori methods from an armchair. Now, I don't believe in any of that. So I'm actually not in favor of an awful lot of what's done in metaphysics. I mean, we could go into this sometime. I'm not as extreme in my rejection of what's done in metaphysics as Lederman and company, but I'm pretty much in the same camp. But I, unlike them, I see a much more positive role for philosophy in metaphysics. I don't know, that is empirical philosophy, metaphysics informed by science. And if I had to give a short answer to why is that worth doing, well, I could say a lot more about exactly what metaphysics informed by science is going to be like. And I'm against any metaphysics that's, as it were, totally unmoored from science. So I could say more about what it's like, but why is it worthwhile? Well, I'm getting back to my first question. Look, for us humans, our triumph is that we actually know about the world we live in, and the sort of empirically informed metaphysics that I'm in favor of is an investigation of the nature. What is the world like? Since it's metaphysics, you might say it's what it's sort of like ultimately, with foundational issues about what it's like. And so what is there too? What is there and what's it like? What could be more important to human beings?
Right.
But as I said, I could say a bit more about the positive side, because as you and I don't know how many of your listeners know, Lederman and company, in their wonderfully provocative book, Everything Must Go, really don't find much place for metaphysics at all. And any place it does have is very tied to physics. I think that is a mistake.
I hope we can get into that later on.
Good.
But so one conception of metaphysics that you definitely reject is in this book, Putting Metaphysics First, is a picture of metaphysics that arises from the linguistic turn. So I wanted to, ask a very sweeping question maybe about the linguistic turn, and what is the linguistic turn, and what do you see as its main shortcomings?
Right. Yes. Well, there are two aspects to it, I suppose. There's the idea that metaphysical issues really are linguistic issues, issues about language, or sometimes issues about concepts. And there's a more a better view, which is that they are to be approached from a perspective in language. That is, you solve the metaphysics. All right, you accept that they're not, metaphysical issues are not linguistic issues, but you nonetheless think that you should approach them from a linguistic point of view. And of course, the examples are all over the place, but I suppose, an example that I sort of approve of, I don't approve of their thesis, but I do think the logical positivists were really moved things ahead, particularly in their critical work. But they don't quite fit what I said, because they, of course, their line was the elimination of metaphysics. And basically, metaphysical issues were not, they were actually replaced by issues of language. And I think this was a very unhappy idea. As you know, and your watchers would know, the idea is that all these, the great metaphysical dispute between realists and idealists should really be just understood as a dispute over languages, which language to choose, and the choice is pragmatic. And all language, so how could this be, you think? How could it be? And I mean, if it's just a pragmatic choice, can we just choose anything? No, it's all got to be moored, according to them, in the given. Because the language, whether you choose your idealist language or you choose your realist language, it gets its meaning from its relationship to the given. This is and then you can choose whichever suits your taste. So look, it looks like, oh, wait a minute. So the thing that's really controlling everything here, what we can and can't say, because we can't just say anything, is the given. And then, of course, that raises the issue of the metaphysics of the given. What is the given? And in a way, what they did mostly was push this problem under the carpet. This is, of course, a wonderful article, beautiful article by Morris Schlitt in, I don't know, 34 or 5, on the positivist approach to the realism. And it's beautifully written and wonderful. He confronts this, yes. Are they just replacing old-fashioned metaphysics in all its richness and so on with now a metaphysics of the given? And he rejects this and so on. And I don't think he rejects it satisfactorily. So basically, I think the whole slogan of elimination of metaphysics and replacement with linguistic thesis is really a mystification. It's not an elimination of metaphysics. It's a mystification of metaphysics, because it's sort of hiding it out of sight. And then, of course, if you take, again, I don't say these are the only examples. I mean, the linguistic turn is to be found, for example, on the continent, in France, for example. And so I don't think what I'm saying now, but then you've got the other, in my unhappy experience as an undergraduate and growing up, you might say, in philosophy, there were positivists, who in my view were on the good side, despite what I've just said, and then with the ordinary language philosophy, dominating Oxford, which was presented, in fact, in a book as a revolution in philosophy. It seems to me a counter-revolution. It seemed to me to be taking philosophy back. I'm not alone in thinking this, really back. And there you get the idea that philosophical, metaphysical issues are to be approached by a study of language, ordinary language, or else ordinary concepts, conceptual analysis, as it was called. And of course, all this examination was typically a priori. And I think this is terribly mistaken for lots of reasons. So, I mean, if you wanted to remember these days, or you're too young to know this, but you would be interested in moral issues. And suddenly the issues you're interested in are the language of morals. And that was a book written. Who wrote it? The Language of Morals. You're interested in the secondary properties, what redness and things like that. And suddenly you find the whole debate is all about
the language
concepts of secondary quality. This is a terrible mistake. And perhaps the main, not mind you, if you actually knew much about, the language of morals, if you knew much of particularly the true statements, apparently true statements, and you knew much about concepts, then it may be very likely you would actually know something about the metaphysics. But the trouble is we don't know anything very much about concepts. Concepts are incredibly difficult to know anything about. It's an empirical study on which people have made very little progress. Language is something we know very little about. I mean, that's where I spend my life, of studying language and concepts. And it's just bloody hard. And we know much more. We know much more about morality than we know about the language of morals. We know much more about biology than we know about the language of biology, the language of physics. We know. So it's totally the wrong way around. And it's led people astray.
Yeah. And I guess, this is a point you make in the book and also throughout your whole career, this arguing against kind of epistemic and semantic approaches to realism. Yes. And I wanted to ask you sort of almost a historical question. So throughout your career, would you say you have seen a shift in the popularity of these approaches to realism? Because it seems to me they're not as popular now as they were in like the 70s and 80s.
Look, I hope, if I were religious, I'd say pray that you're right. I've got to say, I've never been much good at following, keeping track of trends. So you may be right. There's no doubt that the sort of approaches that I've just been mentioned, well, positivism is sort of pretty dead.
Yeah.
It survived in the philosophy of science longer than anywhere else. But I think Kuhn and Feyerabend a pretty devastating job on ending its reign in the philosophy of science, and Popper too, to a certain degree. But ordinary language philosophy, I think it's probably pretty dead. But then its sort of close ally, conceptual analysis, seems to be alive and well. People talk about it all the time. Of course, it's not too clear exactly what they mean by it. So I don't know I'm sure that what I'm complaining about here is still around. What you're thinking probably, as far as the realism of dispute is concerned, there was the enormous influence of Michael Dummett, who was a wonderfully clever philosopher, but seemed to me to have a very bad influence on philosophy. And because he, of course, was very upfront about the realism issue, really is an issue about meaning and understanding. So that was quite an extreme view, and presented, of course, as you'd expect, in a very sophisticated way. And it had, I think, a terrible influence. Who else? Maybe. Yeah, so maybe you're right. I mean, Dummett's influence, I think, has waned enormously, which I see as very positive. Another influential philosopher of the 70s, the American philosopher Donald Davidson. Now, whereas Dummett was quite clearly embracing a mistaken view, it seems to me, about the realism. Davidson's position is much more obscure on this and just about everything. But I don't think that Davidson was an anti-realist. But, and his influence has waned too, which I see as a good move in the right direction. But yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe things are getting better.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this might be a kind of a very vexed sociological question, but you mentioned something about you going from Australia to do philosophy in the US. And at one point in the book, you speak about John Mackey as an unfashionable Australian, and you contrast him towards this kind of Oxford Michael Dummett approach to realism. Do you think there is an influence of like Australian philosophy in this question? That
it's always a bit embarrassing to talk about your own country. It does seem to me that in philosophy, Australia, and let us not forget our Kiwi cousins, the New Zealanders, are much, really, as one says, really punch above their weight. I mean, Australians seem to have a much bigger role in philosophy and New Zealanders than you would expect from a relatively small country. And I don't know why this is. In an area of philosophy that I'm particularly interested in, biology, philosophy of biology, it's really very striking how many of the leading philosophers of biology are Australians. And as I said, I don't know how to explain this. And one of the odd things that really about Australians' view, since you asked this, is I said that I was the first one to go to America. All my teachers had gone to Oxford. And this was Oxford of what I regard as the dark days of ordinary language philosophy and rampant Wittgensteinianism and so on. And what's striking is that nearly all of them came back relatively unscarred from this. I mean, you don't see much sign of that in Armstrong or Graham Merlick, another one of my teachers who wrote a wonderful book about space. They seem to have got an education and come back without sort of having lost it, as it were. John Mackey is an interesting case. Now, I've forgotten where he got educated. Wonderfully clever guy. And he was a very vigorous critic of ordinary language philosophy in the 50s and 60s. But he went to Oxford. In fact, he was my teacher only for about a year and a half, and then off he headed to Oxford. Yeah. So I don't know what it is about why Australians are so into philosophy and been so influential. You're right. I mean, the theory of the mind, it's quite obvious that Australia played a very dominant view in moving the theory of mind away from behaviorism, Rilean behaviorism, and all sorts of other behaviorism. One thinks of Smart and Place and Armstrong. And then we get David Lewis, now, of course, an American, but David Lewis was really an honorary Australian. David was in Australia every summer in America for 3 or 4 months. He was like part of it among us every year for something like 30 years. There was David, and he contributed. Of course, he had a very powerful mind, and he contributed a lot to Australia. And in some ways, I think quite bad things because of his analytic metaphysics and so on. But also, he of course was instrumental in moving the the world away from behaviorism. He was along with Armstrong and Smart and people. And then, of course, there was also another one of my teachers who was at Harvard, Hilary Putnam, had a terrific role in that. Yeah. So I don't know. I can't explain what it is about Australia.
yeah, I don't know. It's as you say, it's a very difficult question to keep track of trends and so on. So I wanted to move away from that now and just go to the realism question. So as you indicated before, a problem with starting with semantics and settling the realism question is that often case it's very difficult to know what the correct semantic theory is. And you have a sort of Morean argument against starting with semantics, and that's the realism is much more plausible than any semantic theory we have or we might have. So I was wondering if you could say something more about the sort of semantic theories that have been used to undermine realism, maybe Michael Dummett's theory or so on.
Yes, well, Michael Dummett's theory, of course. Yeah, when you sent me the question, I thought, well, there's so many examples, and which one to pick on here? And I think in a way Michael Dummett may not be the best. I mean, there's Michael Dummett basically thought that realism issues collapsed into were sort of metaphors. He actually used that phrase. Yeah. They're metaphors, I think. Metaphors. He first proposed this in the context of discussing mathematics. They're metaphors for linguistic issues and the semantic issues. And the semantic issues are to be really approached as, he had the famous slogan, theory of meaning is a theory of understanding. At least I think that. So the semantic issue of the theory of meaning becomes an issue of the theory of understanding, and then the issue there becomes what could a human being understand? And here we have an a priori theory of linguistic comprehension of what is possible and so on and so forth. And that's sort of analogous to what had happened in modern philosophy before the linguistic turn, which was the epistemic turn or the epistemological turn. Modern philosophy was characterized by approaching all the metaphysical issues, the great metaphysical issues, from a perspective in epistemology, what we could know. And the trouble is, our epistemology and in the modern philosophy and in the linguistic turn, our semantics, it's very hard to know. I mean, where does Dummett's theory of understanding come from? What's the basis for it? Where is the empirical evidence for it? But of course, it had pretty disastrous effect on the thesis of realism when you went. Now, exactly how is a little bit complicated. But then with Putnam, you got the theory of reference. Well, he had his famous model theoretic argument aimed at the idea of a determinate notion of reference and so on. And he tied reference and correspondence truth to the realism doctrine, and his critique of reference, in his mind, brought down realism. But all of this seems to me to be a confusion. I mean, I don't think the theory of reference has anything to do with realism. Perhaps the most dramatic example of the damage that this sort of approach can have is with Thomas Kuhn. I mean, Thomas Kuhn was enormously influential. His book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, is, I believe, one of the most widely read books in philosophy, and so it should be. It's a wonderfully vivid picture of the history of science and of the epistemology of science. And it was so much, I first read it at the end of the 60s, and it's so much it's got so much better a feel for the epistemology of science than the positivists had, which is what it was aimed at. So it's wonderful in that respect, but it's accompanied by terrible semantics and terrible, and result of that, terrible metaphysics. And this, if I may moralize a bit, this is a sort of problem with semantics. Everyone thinks they can do it. You know, all philosophers, even if they have no training in the theory of meaning or thing, they think they can sit in their armchair and they can figure out about meaning. And not just philosophers, psychologists. Psychology is the theory of concepts in psychology, and it's bedeviled by amateur semantics, which is very poor, very poor. Things like prototype theory and things like that, really. I mean, it's philosophers who've been trained in this stuff. It's not that we suppose we know a vast amount, because it's so hard to know anything in philosophy. But we sort of know where the bodies are buried. we know what is already shown to be mistaken, like verifiability. So we know a lot of mistakes not to make. But dear old Kuhn, so he's got all his lovely history and epistemology, but what's he to say about the world? And when he starts thinking about that, he starts doing semantics, and he plugs in an absolutely naive description theory of reference without even thinking. He doesn't see this as an assumption. So the word, well, let's take the word the earth, the name, the earth. There was the astonishing scientific revolution, Copernican revolution, of course, and we came to think that the earth wasn't the center of the universe, but the sun didn't go around the earth, and so on and so forth. We got the modern astronomical view. A dramatic change in our theory. So Kuhn thinks about this, and he thinks, well, our term earth used to refer to the center of the universe around which the sun went and all this. So my goodness, there isn't any such thing. So the word earth, as we used to think of it, didn't refer to anything. But of course, the word earth now refers to something, and it refers to what we also. And so you get the naive description theory leading you to a bad ontological assumption. And then, of course, you get the relativism that came with it. So look, the earth existed relative to Ptolemaic astronomy, and it exists relative to a different sort of earth, exists relative to our current Copernican astronomy. But that's all there is to ontology. It's always just relative. So when you change theories, you change worlds. And now he wasn't comfortable with this conclusion, but he wasn't thinking clearly enough about it to really see that he was going down a quite mistaken path, misled by his somewhat naive semantics. So, I mean, that's a very vivid picture. And Kuhnian metaphysics was enormously influential. That is the really bad stuff. The Kuhnian philosophy of science was influential, terrific. The metaphysics was influential too. And what you got in the 20th century, from a lot of perspectives, from Kuhn, we just mentioned, I'm sorry to say, from my old teacher, Hilary Putnam, and from countless other influences, including Nelson Goodman, another one of my teachers, you got the awful metaphysics that the known world is made by us in some way. By our concepts or our language. You get it in I'm having a moment of I've forgotten the name. So you've got all through the 20th century, you've got this sort of neo-Kantian relativist metaphysics. That the known world is our construction. This is the metaphysics of the 20th century, it seems to me. It was just everywhere. And it led almost nothing untouched. It went right through the post-structuralist, postmodernist people, right through even to people studying. It went through anthropology. It went through it went people studying worthy social causes like feminism and so on. So it was, and in my view, the idea that we make the known, which Kant is responsible for, he's not responsible for the relativism, but that we make the known world with our concepts and so on, seems to me the greatest bad idea in the history of philosophy.
Yeah, so I suppose like a master argument for thinking that it is relevant to the realism dispute is something like this. So take this cup here. First, I have some kind of thought that there is something I'm talking about. I'm referring to something when I say cup. I'm referring to this. But then there's kind of a second premise saying that if the cup is anyway like realism supposes it's a kind of a thing in itself, then we couldn't talk about it. We couldn't refer to it.
Yes.
So thus I have to conclude that the cup is sort of mind framed or conceptual in some way.
That's the sort of
I was wondering. So your Morean argument for exactly. So your Morean kind of argument for starting with realism is kind of saying that any theory which would make it the case that I can't refer to realism's the cup as conceived by realism would have to be false. Is that how you see your argument?
Well, I do start my argument for realism again when I'm arguing against the anti-realism of modern philosophy inspired by epistemology, and the anti-realism of contemporary philosophy inspired by the philosophy of language. I do start my argument with the Morean point you mentioned, which is, look, on the one hand, we've got the doctrine realism, and on the other hand, you've got your epistemology or your semantics, which you rightly show is in opposition to realism. But we have that old Morean approach. Look, so if semantic thesis is true, then not realism. But if realism is true, then not the semantic thesis. And which of these two arguments should we prefer? And the Morean line is, well, we should prefer the second one. But I don't rest on that. I say that this Morean line is supported by naturalism. That is the idea that all we can know, there's only one way of knowing, the empirical way best exemplified, but not only exemplified in science. And so we've got to look at the evidence for these doctrines and the evidence for the existence and independence of the familiar world. Let's not even get to science, stones and trees and cats. The evidence for that is massively greater than the evidence for any semantic thesis or any epistemological thesis you could come up with. Because it's a real struggle to get to the truth in those areas. So that's an approach. That's the sort of, that's the naturalistic argument, not just the Morean argument.
Right. Yeah. So I guess that's a presumption that you very much turn against. And this is kind of this presumption that we have a privileged access, or we have closer access to semantic facts, or our way of the way that our thoughts relate to the world. We can somehow come to know that before we come to know facts about the world. And you call this at some point a Cartesian picture.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. And so how would you say that your naturalism contrasts with this Cartesian picture of philosophy that's very common throughout the linguistic turn and so on?
Well, so I'm just trying to get my handle on this question. The Cartesian, let's just say a word or two about the Cartesian picture. Now, we're talking about the Cartesianism in semantics. This is the idea that everyone who is competent in part of a language, say anyone competent with the term read, say, so, or if you want to put it, anyone who has the concept redness, simply in virtue of being thus conceptually or linguistically competent, that person knows facts about the meaning, reference, content of the concept or term. That's the Cartesianism. Simply from being this ever, I call it Cartesian because it's obviously reflecting, capturing an idea back to Descartes that we are, or we can be, easily aware of the workings of our own mind are in some way transparent to us. So we can look inward and know facts about things in our mind. I see no basis for this assumption, no basis for assuming that just because you are competent with the word read, you know that, put in anything you like in the way of a semantic claim. You know that it refers to blah-de-blah-de-blah, or you know that it entails blah-de-blah-de-blah, or whatever. I don't see any basis for that. I see linguistic competence as a skill and has all the marks of a skill. So just as you can you can have the skill of throwing a frisbee without knowing that, and then put in whatever the theory of throwing frisbees is, or you can know how to ride a bicycle, you've got a skill and not have anything interesting to say or any interesting beliefs about exactly what this consists of, or to go to something more cognitive, you can be a competent thinker and not know a whole lot of facts about what competent thinking consists in. So I just think there's no basis. It's a skill, and you can catch baseballs, ride bicycles, throw frisbees, think, talk languages without having any interesting beliefs about those things, or have anything interesting to say about it.
Yeah,
that's
so
really a central. This is more central to my approach to language and mind than it is perhaps to the realism issue and so on. Though it does play a role in my opposition to Determinate, I suppose.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask another question on this Cartesian picture, because it seems that like Descartes himself was not maybe as concerned about the relationship between like our concepts or conceptual schemes and reality. He was more kind of concerned with, how do I know that my beliefs are true?
Yes.
Whereas this kind of more post-Kantian or neo-Kantian turn is often kind of against Cartesian skepticism. And they argue that Cartesian skepticism only makes sense on a certain like metaphysical, realistic picture of the world. But if we think of the world as being kind of created or constituted by our concepts, that skepticism kind of dissolves, is the thought. So I was wondering, what do you think is the relationship between these two types of skepticism? So one being about a world as like not constituted by our concepts, and on the other hand, this more Cartesian or pre-Kantian skepticism.
I think of it like this. I think you're quite right to think that a really big change came in the sort of metaphysics epistemology world with Kant, really big. consider him in contrast to the British empiricists. I mean, the British empiricists all struggled with this sort of argument, my sort of schematic form. Here is my epistemological theory. This is a theory of what we do know and what we can know. And of course, for all of them, it started with, because they had the picture show theory of the mind, for all of them, it started with knowledge of ideas, right? So that's my epistemology. Let's call that theory E, right? Then they struggled, and this is the sort of terrifically, the Cartesian problematic. And we just go back to the wonderful meditations of Descartes to see it so vividly. Now, if that's true, if E is true, and realism was true, we couldn't know anything. That is, if the world really was external to our mind in the realist way, we couldn't know about it. Well, I mean, that runs right through the agony of the wonderful British empiricists, and just their such engaging philosophy it is. And that runs through it all. And you'll remember this wonderful line in I think in Berkeley's Principles, where he says, realism is, or materialism, I've forgotten exactly what he calls it, but I would call it realism is the root of skepticism. That is, if you believe realism, then you're not going to be able to, you won't know anything. And so, faced with that, if the realists are right, then we don't know anything. That came Berkeley's conclusion that realism isn't right. And and Locke, of course, struggled with this issue. But as most scholars, I think, believe, his answer was really very feeble to this. And Berkeley really sort of won that argument. But what the naturalists will say, hold on a second, where all of this trouble for realism came from this epistemological thesis E. Mm-hmm. So that, it seems to me, that was the debate that we find in Locke, Berkeley, and Hume and so on, and around that. But now when you move to Kant, I mean, Kant had, of course, he said Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumbers, and Kant had a brilliant, but it seems to me desperately wrong-headed response to this, which is, look, I mean, I oversimplified, obviously, but the way to solve this is to see that the so-called material objects that we seem to lose with Berkeley and so on, that really they are, we partly constitute them. We can know about them, putting it simply, we can know about them because we make them. Now that's a real change in the game. And it was a solution to skepticism. I mean, so Kant had a solution to skepticism. It's just a terrible solution. Berkeley, I mean, Locke had a very feeble solution to skepticism. Berkeley, I mean, it's really, Locke is, I just love Locke. I mean, it's this wonderful arguments in there. And you can see him struggling and being torn, both the naturalistic direction and then the more traditional philosophy direction. Berkeley, of course, only was able to save stones and trees and cats with a preposterous assumption about God, which, none of us should take seriously. So he saved himself from skepticism with a preposterous assumption, and Kant did it with a different and much more, we can see, this is why I think this is the greatest bad idea of all time. This has got enormous appeal. Kant's influence is so great that many of these awful metaphysics of the 20th century never mention him.
Mm.
And I've still forgotten the writer, God, who had such an influence in America. A senior moment.
Rorty.
Just forget.
Rorty.
One forgets names. It's really frightening.
Rorty, Goodman, or
no. It's he wasn't a philosopher at all. Worf.
Yeah.
Benjamin Lee Worf. Worf has a totally Kantian metaphysics. Never mentions the name.
Yeah.
Okay? So the influences of Kant's ideas just are everywhere. As I said, wed Kant's ideas to relativism, and you get the metaphysics of the 20th century, running all the way from French feminists to Nelson Goodman,
right?
via Kuhn and Putnam and God.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, I mean, this is might be a caricature of the history of philosophy, but sometimes it's said that there's like this metaphysics was first, so like Plato, Aristotle, and then there was this epistemological turn with Descartes, and then there was this kind of semantic turn from like Kant onwards. Maybe that's
yes,
but yes. But then you're now proposing that we should go back in some sense, put metaphysics first. So I was wondering, how can you? What is the reason to think that we, I'll read your book and I'll find it completely compelling, and then there's this dialectic that happens again. So that your proposal of going back to metaphysics first, how do we stop? How do we stop this?
The sort of, I mean, my perspective here, the naturalistic perspective, it comes from Quine, who was one of my teachers. But actually, I got it from Putnam, because when I first heard Putnam lecture in 1967, he was at that point very much in the Quinean naturalistic. So that was before he went off the rails in the mid-70s. But so, look, you want to know how you know? You look to science. There is nowhere else to look to. Well, that's a bit of oversimplification, but you just look to science. We can look to science to find out how people or any organism knows about the world. And that cognitive ethologists are doing this. They're figuring out how lots of animals know about the world. It's an empirical study. And we can have an empirical study of how we humans know about the world. And that's what naturalistic epistemology is. And we have to face it. It's enormously hard to make any progress. So that's how we find out. But how did we ever get to the idea that we don't know anything? That's, what do you mean? Where did that come from?
I guess one challenge that's plaguing realism of this, the kind of realism that thinks that the world is ready-made there for us to discover, is that sort of the thought is that science might converge on a set of kinds that are not salient, objectively salient. They're just like, it seems to us from our human perspective that they're important, but in actuality they're not. And then you would have this sort of skeptical worry that our scientific picture of the world would be incomplete in some important sense. So even if we could have like our basic beliefs about cups and so on might be true, we'd still lose out on reality structure or something like that. What do you think about that sort of skeptical problem on realism?
Look, I'm not sure I've got entire grasp of what this problem is supposed to be, but it's central to the naturalistic approach that you could be wrong. You could even be dramatically wrong. But so what? We don't think we are wrong, and we have good reason to think we're not wrong. But yeah, we could be wrong. We could be wrong about little things, and in fact, one of the things about science that's very striking is that we are finding we're wrong about little things all the time. We correct our views. But we could also be wrong about really big things, sort of grand theories. But nonetheless, we have, I think, good reason to suppose that, again, just from looking at the history of science, that we are, in fact, progressing and moving. We're learning more and more about the world. We're getting rid of false beliefs and we're replacing them with good ones. And there's a sort of accumulation of knowledge. More important, perhaps that's silly, not more important, but very important, is we're improving our methods of finding out. So our epistemic practices are improved just overwhelmingly in the last 200 or 300 years. That a great amount of the progress we've made in science has been in not just in what we found out about the world, but in what we found out about how to find out about the world. An obvious feature of this is we've got a lot of artifacts which we use to help us find out about the world. It all sort of started with telescopes and magnifying glasses and things like that, but then we've, of course, moved on to extraordinarily elaborate and clever things like electron microscopes and so on. So we've got also, and we've improved our techniques of using it. So the young physicist and the young psychologist and the young linguist, they're educated in how to find out. They're not just told about their subject, they're told how to find out. What's our method? This is an important part of the education of the young scientist, the method of discovery. And what we've learned about all that is just enormous. So, sure, we could. That's such as like the epistemic life is hard. You can be wrong, but so what? Just get on with it.
Yeah, I suppose I suppose the thought is that that would be in some sense absurd. That like a completely idealized form of science that just has all empirical facts to dispose of and so on. Like if that cannot be right, then we just have some sort of absurdity. But I suppose you would reject that.
And what's supposed to be absurd?
It's supposed to be absurd that we wouldn't be able to know about the world fully if we had all the empirical facts, because there would be this problem of mismatch between the kinds that we use.
The whole idea of having all the empirical facts seems weird. I mean, the empirical facts are open-ended. I mean, life goes on. We move, tomorrow something will happen. So we have some evidence we didn't have today. I mean, so to take a point that's something that's played a role in the debate about scientific realism, there's the worry that, oh well, you've got your theory which posits unobservable, but here's another equivalent theory that posits the same different unobservables, and it fits the evidence just as well. But this is a naive picture of science, because theories don't confront the evidence alone. They can, as Quine pointed out, they confront it, and of course Kuhn is wonderful on this. They confront it with a whole lot of auxiliary hypotheses, assumptions about the background. For example, in astronomy, assumptions about how many planets are around. Which is it's not a theory, it's not a sort of some law, it's just a brute fact of what's there. So there are these background assumptions and auxiliary hypotheses, and over time these change. We learn more about, we're not just, so our theory of some phenomena turns out to be false when we realize that we feed in some different auxiliary hypotheses which show it to be false, to show that it then doesn't really match reality. So there isn't such, the whole idea of all the evidence seems just, the evidence is open-ended.
Right.
The evidence is open-ended. The auxiliary hypotheses that might be wedded to your theory, we don't know how. We can't foresee the future, so we don't know. We don't know what in the future we may discover to be a much more appropriate auxiliary hypothesis to, or piece of background information to wed to our theory when trying to see whether the empirical results confirm or disconfirm our theory.
Right. I see. Yeah. So, yeah, I wanted to move on to some more questions about knowledge and perhaps in relation to between science and philosophy. So one essay in your book concerns intuitions, and it's sometimes said that the use of intuition pumps and so on are ubiquitous in philosophy.
Yes.
And you have a specific naturalistic view of intuitions, that they're differing from many other judgments only in being immediate and unreflective and not based on any conscious reasoning, and that they're kind of empirical predictions of that are based on acquaintance with kinds and not concepts throughout one's life and so on. And I wanted to ask you about some cases of like abstracta and so on in philosophy. So it seems that the kinds that philosophers are interested in are not always empirical kinds, like rabbits or cats and so on, and their nature, but also kind of truth reference as you talk about, and the good and so on. So how do you think the practice of intuition pumping in philosophy about these areas, is that kind of naturalistically safe, or should we do something else instead of asking question about the nature of these kind of abstract things?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a lot here. So look, I am sometimes mischaracterized as thinking there is no place for intuitions in philosophy and so on. That isn't my view at all. Or I've written quite a bit about linguistics, and I certainly don't say that about linguistics. That is, intuitions about syntax seem to me to definitely have a place in the search for knowledge in linguistics, and so I'm not like that. I think about what they are, these intuitions, just what you say. They're reflecting the knowledge that the intuitor has already gathered. If it's maybe just an ordinary member of the folk, then in ordinary life, then maybe it's a scientist who's gathered from education. She's gathered certain intuitions, certain knowledge, so she's very good at intuiting what's going on, as it were, just on the basis of education. So it seems to me the intuitions reflect empirical, hard-won knowledge about kinds. And so how much you should rely on them depends on how expert the person is. But even if you rely on them and you think they're expert enough, in the short run, you shouldn't rely on them altogether in the long run, because you can then go and test the intuitions. But the intuitions can be a very good starting point. And in a way, it all comes down to intuition. I mean, from the naturalistic perspective, I think of when I see my lawn and I say the grass is green, or I see it and I say, let's take an unhappy situation, the grass is brown. That's a perceptual judgment formed by looking at the world. It seems to me on exactly the same par as the sort of intuitions we have. And in basically, science comes down to accepting judgments like that. You know, in physics, you're accepting judgments about meter readings and chemistry. You're accepting judgments about the color of the litmus paper and so on. So I'm not knocking a role for intuitions. I just think we have to look at them very critically and see them as empirical judgments, and and maybe they're the best evidence we have to go by at this point, but we should look at them critically. So I do want to say that, but your quote of me has got me dead right. So how does this work? All right, this may seem okay. What Devitt has to say may seem okay when you're thinking about doing biology or doing chemistry. But you ask, what about reference and truth? Well, I want to take a very, very hard line here. I like to think that what I do in the theory of reference is empirical. And that's it. And intuitions you have, and I've got very involved in experimental semantics. So, and there we are actually looking critically at intuitions, and we're not simply relying on them. And so I think that theories of reference and theories of truth do need to be, they may start, and this is perfectly respectable, from intuitions, but these intuitions are empirical judgments. And so we then have to proceed to see if they're the right empirical judgments, and we should also try and move beyond them. Not just testing them, but seeing if we can get other evidence. So, for example, when you're testing theories of reference, you don't just take people's intuitions, the philosopher's intuitions, for granted, and you don't just go out and test the folk intuitions. You actually try and see, well, what's the reality? Let's test the theory against reality, and the reality is the language as it is used. So you look at the use of language. Does it actually confirm the theory that of reference in question? That is, if that theory of reference was true, then people wouldn't say this in certain circumstances. Do they say it? That's an empirical question. Or if your theory of reference is true, then they would say this in this circumstance. Do they? So you don't have to ask about intuitions. You just go out or you can even just observe the corpus. Do people say in these situations? In other words, it's a totally scientific sort of situation. Just like when you're doing biology, you can go out and simply look at the living things and figure out if your theory confirms with what they, or else you can do some experiments where you start interfering with the living things and seeing whether they do things work out as they should according to your theory. So I see the study of theory of meaning and reference and truth all in a very empirical way, and I like to think that's what I'm doing.
Right.
But you also mentioned, I noticed in the questions you sent me, you mentioned the investigation of goodness.
Right.
And I think you also mentioned, didn't you, did you mention mathematicians? Numbers, for example.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, now we're getting. I'm not nearly as confident here as I am in the areas of because I spend my life doing reference. But I think, as you noted in your question, I have actually written just one paper on moral properties. So, because I was asked to attend a conference and they wanted something on moral realism and so on. But basically, I want to take the same line there that I just did with reference. Yeah. We shouldn't just be relying on intuitions. We shouldn't just be relying on the famous trolley cases and so on. We should be testing these intuitions against the reality. How? Well, that's whereas I have answer to that question when we get to reference, and I don't have much to say here at all. I mean, the problem is, and of course, as everyone, how do you naturalize morals? Leave aside the before we start worrying about investigating them, how do you naturalize it? What is a moral property? And of course, we know this is an incredibly difficult issue. Vast range of opinions. A lot of them are limitativist. Now, I'm a realist about even moral properties, but that doesn't mean to say I have a decent theory of how to naturalize them. I got some ideas. I was borrowing from others. I was very impressed with the sort of thinking about this by the Cornell realists, as they're called. So I think that moral properties supervene on non-moral properties. So the key issue is what non-moral properties, and it seems to me I don't have much helpful to say. I really wish I did, but I haven't worked on this area. But I mean, I assume we're going to have to look for some fairly brutish properties, but also some very subtle social properties that moral properties supervene on. And all I'm doing, of course, is waving my hands here. I'm gesturing at a naturalistic account of morals, which I don't pretend to be able to give. But I do sort of feel I can see the direction of such an account. And as I said, I mentioned the Cornell realists. But then you get to mathematics. Okay, and I've always had the same line on mathematics. It's too hard. I just don't know what to make of mathematics. Two of my dearest friends were at war on this. Hartree Field wrote a wonderful book, Science Without Numbers, where approaching the issue of mathematics from just the sort of perspective, scientific and naturalistic perspective that I would want to approach it, he argued that we could get by in science without numbers. And he even gave an account of what pure mathematics would be like. Saul Kripke, on the other hand, was utterly outraged by all this. I myself have no worthwhile opinion about mathematics. I think it's just one of the great mysteries. I'm sort of fond of saying I hope Hartree is right, but I don't know if he is. And so I agree. I don't know what to say about mathematics. I don't know how to naturalize it. And if you don't know the metaphysics, it's hard to give an answer on the epistemology. I mean, Paul Bonassarov long ago made a wonderful point about Platonism, that if Platonism were true, how could we ever know about numbers? I mean, wonderful paper he wrote. So Platonism seems to me to be sort of preposterous. But what it's enormously appealing to mathematicians, because it's the way it feels to them, that they're actually having insight into these sort of abstract entities. I assume that's what Saul thought. I know, but that seems to me almost mystical. But I only wish I could say something useful as an alternative picture. I don't have anything to say, so I can't say anything interesting about the metaphysics. So of course, since I think that comes first, I can't say anything interesting about how we know about mathematics. But I think if we could get the metaphysics straight, we wouldn't have any serious trouble saying how we know about mathematics.
Right. Okay. Well, maybe if we stick to morality, I mean, is the kind of picture, even if you don't have a specific reductionist program in mind, is the picture that we're kind of empirically interacting with various kinds. So, for example, people exhibit kindness or goodness, and I interact with people, so I interact with this property, and then I can form a theory about what this property consists in.
Yes.
And I was wondering, do you have a kind of, would this be a kind of a natural kind? Would this be a natural kind, do you think? And that we, given the various descriptive meanings that we associate with goodness, so people have various different theories about what that could be, they nevertheless refer to the very same property by means of its kind of its special status among all the properties that you could pick out. Is that the kind of picture you have in mind, or
we're talking morals.
yes, only morals.
Yeah. Look, I don't say I've always been perfect about this, but I tend to avoid talking of natural kinds because I don't know what they are. So I don't find that a helpful term. So I'm not going to claim that I think being good is a natural kind. But I think, look, I don't know what more I can say. I feel a little uncomfortable about shooting my mouth off when I am only too well aware how I do not really have any worked out answer. I mean, I do think that goodness or rightness or whatever is to be explained. Or take some more sort of less simply moral terms like cruel. I think that they supervene on what you might call, fairly brutish properties and also quite non-brutish social properties. And I have nothing. I don't really. It's no real future in getting me to say, because I don't think I'll say anything worthwhile. I just don't. That's my belief that they do supervene in this way, but exactly how, and that's the interesting question, of course, I can't say. I do think that the absolutely unself-conscious intuition mongering that goes on in moral philosophy is regrettable.
Yeah. Okay. So, using that, we can go to the last question I had, which is about maybe not just moral philosophy, but metaphysics in general, which often involves some sort of intuition mongering, as you say. So, do you have any kind of general thoughts about sort of the current state of analytic metaphysics and like grounding, naturalness, these sort of
right? Yes.
debates?
Well, look, as I indicated sort of near the beginning, I'm rather in the same camp as Lederman and company with the everything must go. But I'm not as extreme as they are. I do think that a lot of this analytic metaphysics, which is totally unmoored from science, is not appropriate. Let me just take an example which has been sort of pressed in on. I mean, mostly I move in a world where I'm not actually sort of engaging with analytic metaphysics, but recently I've returned to an issue which goes back to the 70s when I first got involved, is the issue of nominalism, and particularly the so-called ostrich nominalism. Ostrich nominalism is a term that was invented by my teacher in Australia, David Armstrong, to a pejorative term he introduced into the debate to describe the Quinean position. And the Quinean position is that the one over many problem is a pseudo problem, and that this is not. Now, I'm very Quinean about this, and so David and I had an exchange long ago. Quine joined in the exchange. That was 1980, and I mostly left it behind. But then I returned to it a bit, as you will have noticed, since I'm chuffed to see that you read my book, Putting Metaphysics First.
Yeah.
So I returned to it there. Now I'm returning to it again because I've been asked to write a paper on ostrich nominalism. Now, there is a grounding sort of plays a role here. And so that's why I thought mention it as an example of what I'm against here. Now, take the statement, this is red, let's say, okay, pointing at a red rose, right? This is red. Now, does this have to be grounded? Well, I think now, as I thought forever, and I thought at the time of my ostrich paper in 1980, I think that, look, there's a perfectly respectable demand here for an empirical grounding.
Right.
You ask the question, in virtue of what is this red? Perfectly respectable scientific question, and we look for a scientific answer. So we come up with some scientific theory of what makes the object red. And it'll be, as we know, some physical properties and perhaps even relational properties to us, who knows? But there's going to be a whole lot of reductive physics here, which is going to explain the redness. So of course, any decent naturalist will think grounding this is red in those sorts of facts, underlying facts, by an empirical method is absolutely fine. But okay, so now we've got, let's say, the empirical discovery that this is red in virtue of it being P, where P is some basic, let's say it's a fundamental property.
Mm-hmm.
And then the question comes, okay, oh, that's all very nice, says the analytic metaphysics, but I want an explanation of in virtue of which it's P.
Mm.
I don't want a scientific explanation. I want a metaphysical explanation. This needs to be metaphysically grounded. And that's why we've got to talk of universals, or we've got to talk of states of affairs, or whatever. No, we don't. From the naturalistic, Quinian naturalistic perspective, no. Explanation has stopped here. It's always got to stop somewhere, and that's where it stops. Now, it may be it won't stop there forever, because it may be we'll make some more empirical discoveries, and we'll find that P itself has to be explained scientifically in terms of Q. Okay, could be, but no, there's no call for a metaphysical grounding. So I think that a lot of the analytic metaphysics, and as Lederman and company say, I mean, it's done in all seriousness by some very clever people, very clever. You know, you don't come any cleverer than David Lewis, and yet it seems to me mistaken enterprise, yeah. And it's David, God bless him, has had, I mean, the power of his mind has led to a really quite a, well, maybe not just David, presumably there are other influences on this. I mean, there are other really powerful minds like Kip Fine and so on, really elevated this into a busy intellectual enterprise, but it seems to me mistaken.
All right. Well, with those words, I want to thank you so much for coming on today to discuss your book. So thanks to Michael Devitt.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.